I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. I'm joined today by Vincent Prager, founder of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring. Thank you so much for being here today, Vincent.
It's a pleasure. Such a beautiful day.
On location at the museum, which houses your grandfather, Joseph Oppenheimer, and your mother, Eva Prager's artwork, but it's also the former home of Lady Beaverbrook. How did that come to be, that this was the place that you decided to put the artwork, and how did you come to be the owner of this location?
Well, I bought the property, which is called Dayspring, in 1995, more or less by accident. I was on the board then and still am now of the Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation, which was set up by Lord Beaverbrook in the 1950s. And part of that entailed being on the board of the Beaverbrook Art Gallery. And I was at a board meeting, I think it was in June of 1995, and it was a very short meeting and my flight wasn't until the evening. And so I had never been to St. Andrews, and so I drove down at the suggestion of the chairman of the board, who wanted me to see a property that the husband of one of the other board members was building in Quebec, and I'd never been to St. Andrews, so I drove down, met him, saw the property, hated it, and was about to leave. And then I'd heard about Dayspring. Well, he said, actually, do you want to go see Dayspring? And I said, what's Dayspring? And then he told me, and I vaguely remembered that I'd heard of it. And it was a few months after Lady Beaverbrook had died, and it had been put on the market a few weeks before. So we went up to the gate, which is now behind me, and there was a door in the wall, and they rang the doorbell. Well, there wasn't a door. Sorry, they sort of pounded on the door, and we were just about to leave because nobody came, and finally somebody opened the door, and this guy said, "Well, this is Vincent Prager, and he's the director of the Beaverbrook Canadian Foundation. Could he see Dayspring?" And there was a big sign outside saying that it was only open to people if they had a bank letter of reference, which of course I didn't have, but because of my connection with the foundation, I was allowed in, and the famous Dr. McLeod showed me around. And while we were, it was this phenomenal property, and while I was being shown around, I sort of, just to make small talk, said, "Well, how much are they asking for this place?" And he told me, and I couldn't believe it. It was so low, and it was really amazing. So I then had to leave to get the flight back to Montreal, where I live, and so I spoke to the executor of Lady Beaverbrook's estate the next day, whom I did know, and then he sent me the listing and confirmed what the price was, and then I called him back. The first visit was on a Monday, and then I called him on the Tuesday, so I got the listing, I guess, on the Wednesday, called him on the Thursday, and I said, "Well, I'd like to come down and get this out of my system. I don't think I want it, but you never know. So, but I can't come down this coming weekend because there was a big party in Montreal." And he said, and I said, "Well, I am going to be able to come down the following weekend. Could you sort of reserve it for me?" And he said, "Well, it's only been on the market a few weeks, and it's nothing sells very fast in St. Andrews, so don't worry about it, but we can't reserve it for you." So I said, "Okay." And then I was worried. So on Friday, I called him back and I said, "Well, I can't come on Saturday, but I could come on Sunday." So that was arranged, and off I went on Sunday morning. I flew down to St. John, spent the day again looking at the place. Never saw St. Andrews on that occasion either. Came back to Montreal, made an offer on the Monday. They accepted it on the Tuesday, and they got a higher offer on the Wednesday. So my gut feeling of concern was well-founded. I never found out who the other offer was from, but I have my ideas.
Well, in the later part of this interview, I do want to get to your grandfather and your mother's artwork and everything that's inside the museum. But the museum itself is such a huge part of the experience of visiting. And Lady Beaverbrook, being the private person that she was, when you're able to go in this museum, you do get a feeling of her. Was that part of the draw for it, to make this location? And what do you take from all the years you've spent here about her?
Well, when I first bought the place, it was this, and I lived here off and on summers, and in between came a few times for a few weeks here and there. when I bought the property, there were the 2 garages on the other side of the property that I wanted, but I couldn't have them because Dr. McLeod, the vet who sort of managed everything for Lady Beaverbrook, he wanted them for his tractor and for his car. And so they said, when I was negotiating buying the place, they said, well, you can have a right of first refusal on the garages. And I said, well, that's nice. And he said, well, if you want, you can have a right of first refusal on the property next door, which is called Daytime. This is called Dayspring. And so I said, fine. And that property, first I bought the garages a few years later, and then the Daytime was occupied by Dr. McLeod and his wife Ruth, and they had the right to live there rent-free until the latter of them died. And it was Ruth who died last, and she died, it was about 2009, I think, somewhere around there. And so I didn't know about this right of first refusal, how quickly it would have to be exercised, but properties don't sell or didn't at that point sell very fast in St. Andrews. But sure enough, they had 2 unsolicited offers within a week of her dying. So I had to accept the right of first refusal, get the property, and then I thought, well, now I've got 2 houses in St. Andrews next to each other. What do I do? And I'd always had the idea that it would be nice to take the work of my grandfather and my mother and turn it into a museum in Dayspring for those who've come and who will come. This property is ideally designed to be a museum. All the rooms flow into each other, and it's very well suited. Plus, it's a beautiful spot. So that's how the museum really got started. It was like everything else in my life, by accident.
Mm-hmm. And since then, you've come to own some former cars of her. One that's right behind you, the famous Land Rover.
The Land Rover, yes. She bought that in 1955. It's a Series 1 station wagon Land Rover, which is, as I now know, very rare and quite valuable. And anyway, I didn't even know that there was one, because apparently Dr. McLeod sold it to somebody just before I bought the property, so I really had no knowledge of it. And about 2 years ago now, somebody told me, Lady Beaverbrook had a Land Rover, and it's just down the road in Bocabec. And I said, no, I never knew anything about it. And, well, maybe it's for sale. So I said, well, maybe I would want it then. And so he put me in touch with he was the former butler of Lady Beaverbrook, and he put me in touch with the people who owned the car, and I went and had a look at it. And of course, the more I was interested, the more it became expensive. But ultimately, we reached an accommodation, and I bought it and brought it down here. And it's just finally, as of last week, we've had to get some parts for brakes and things like that. So I'm told it's now drivable, so I'm looking forward in the next few days to start driving it around a little bit. But what's particularly rare is that it's completely unrestored, and it only has, I think, 13,000 miles on it. And shortly after I bought it, there was an article in a couple of newspapers, and somebody in California must have seen it, and there's a famous classic car competition called Pebble Beach, and one of the judges at Pebble Beach called me, and he was a judge for Porsche, and he said, I see you bought this car, and my hobby is collecting unrestored old cars. And he said, I'd love to buy it. Do you want to sell it? I said, well, I only just bought it, so I really don't want to sell it, but thank you. And he said, well, let me tell you one thing, and that is, whatever you do, never restore the car, because the car will lose between 30 and 50% of its value as soon as you start repainting it or fixing it up. Just leave it exactly as it is, and it will always be worth a lot of money. And so that's what I've done.
Wow. I feel like Lady Beaverbrook would appreciate that both your dogs, Kino and Ziba, and my dog Maud, you can't see them right now, but they're here with us. She was, like you said, the vet living next door.
Yes.
She was quite a dog person.
Yes, well, both Sir James Dunn and Lady Dunn and Lady Beaverbrook loved little dogs in particular, and they always had a sort of stable full of little Chihuahua-y things. And after Ruth McLeod died, I think Ed Arsenault took charge of the ones that were left over, and the last one died a few years ago.
Wow.
So we now have Ziba and Kino instead.
Why do you think Lady Beaverbrook and now yourself, I'd like to kind of tie those two people together, are so enamored with St. Andrews? You just came here on a whim, really, and now you're practically a local. We see you about 6 months of the year. What was it that drew her to St. Andrews, and what is it that keeps you here for so much of the year, even though your work life is in part in Montreal?
Well, I'm still working full-time as a lawyer specializing in maritime law. Luckily, I can work remotely, which is what I've been doing, especially because of COVID. So the office set up a double-screen computer, and I've got my laptop, and so I can do all my work from here. So before the last 2.5 years, I've been doing it from home, and now I'm doing it from here. And the previous 2 years, it was quite complicated getting the permission to get into New Brunswick, and I had to enlist the local or friend MLAs to make sure that I was able to get in. And this year it was a pleasure because you could just drive, and all of a sudden you were in New Brunswick. I'm not sure that that's going to continue. I'm pretty sure there'll be another lockdown at some point, but anyway, so the first year of COVID, I was here for almost 6 months. And last year I was here for about 4, and this year I'll be here for about 3, something like that. I'm going to head back to Montreal mid-September probably. But I could fly back and forth, but the airfares have become so unbelievably expensive that it makes driving much more realistic.
I think the charm of the building that people can see behind me if they haven't been here before represents in a lot of ways the characteristics of St. Andrews that make it so unique. And this building obviously is one of the more unique places in town. Can you explain your own affection for the town that's grown over the years? What keeps you here so long?
Well, yes, I do have affection for the town, and I have affection for the museum. And please, anybody listening to this who wants to come and visit, we'd love to see you. I think it's nice because, first of all, I've discovered there are a whole lot of people that I've known since I was a kid, people from Montreal or from other parts of North America who I had a connection with long before I bought here, and so it's nice to see them when I come down. One of the people that I've known was the first girl that I met when we moved to Canada in 1949. Wow. When I was 5, and she's living just past the Algonquin, and so there's all sorts of connections that go back to my childhood. But I think on the whole, people are really nice, and it's a nice, relaxing place to go. I love going down to Katie's Cove and go swimming, and it's a pleasant place. And now that I live next door at daytime, we've got bedrooms so that people can come and stay, and so I've got friends most of the time, and I really find it fun having visitors come to the museum, not only because we like to have as many visitors as we can, but most of the people, I would say, are interesting for one reason or another. And they come from, some are local, some are from New Brunswick, some are from the rest of Canada, some are from the USA, and some are from all over the world. And it's very, I try to drop by a little bit every day that we're open, and I've met so many interesting people as a result of this. Or I go down to the beach and talk to people, and I tell them you've got to come and see the museum, and then some of them come, and it's fun. It's like having a relationship with people all the time.
How do you describe, and I'd love to hear how you describe it. I always tell people that it feels like a Wes Anderson movie, your museum. It's so unique, so different and magical. How do you describe it to people who haven't been here? Because it has so many elements, from Lady Beaverbrook to the artists that are your grandfather, your mother.
It's very hard. I must say, I have to admit that I have no idea who Wes Anderson is.
That's all right.
But No, I tell them it's a gorgeous spot. The location is beautiful. The architecture is unique. The work product of my grandfather and my mother is very special. And you put it all together, and with the jewelry and the antique cars and the toys and the horses and everything, and it's something that's really doesn't exist anywhere else. And we've been very, very fortunate. One thing I try to tell people when they come here is if they like it to post something on TripAdvisor, and people have been doing it. And I think we're now one of the 2 or 3 top sites in St. Andrews, which is really very gratifying. But and I think we've had 1 or 2 mediocre reviews, but otherwise they've all been 5-star or 4 or 5-star or something. And so people come and they love it, and it's very gratifying to know that what we've put together is appealing to people. And next year, hopefully, even more so, because we're going to hopefully, if there's no more COVID shutdown, we're hopefully going to open up the 2nd floor where there's also a library and what was a ballroom, and put in more pictures and have more things to show.
Your grandfather, Joseph Oppenheimer, was one of the founders of the German Impressionist movement. Is that correct? And
well, it was called the Berlin Secession. It was I think there were other ones in other cities, but this was the main one. And he organized one of the first exhibitions that they held, and he communicated with John Singer Sargent, and he got him to exhibit at that exhibition as well.
One of the interesting things about the museum is not just the beauty of the work inside, but that you really get a sense of who your grandfather and who your mother was based on many of the portraits of people that they've painted. Einstein is obviously one of the most iconic in your grandfather's works. Can you tell me a little bit about the relationship that he had as a friendship with Einstein?
Well, of course I wasn't born, so I don't know for sure, but I do know that my grandfather met him and was commissioned to do some sketches for him and to do a picture. The picture, we have a reproduction of it at the museum, and my mother copied it, and that's at the museum. But the actual picture itself is lost somewhere. We have no idea where it is, whether it was destroyed during the Second World War or whether it's in some private collection. We just don't know where it is. I don't know, but I always tell people that if it weren't for Einstein, I wouldn't be here, because my parents were invited for my grandparents were invited for tea by the Einsteins when they were still living in Germany. I think this was 1932, and where the Einsteins was living was in this beautiful park called the Grunewald, which is just to the west of Berlin, sort of on the suburbs. And so my grandparents went out there for tea with my mother and her brother, and they were walking through the woods to get to the Einstein house. And the house immediately before that was occupied by my father and his 3 sons. And my father, well, all 3 of them were musicians, but my father was with his 2 brothers were on the balcony, and my father was playing the piano, and my mother looked up as they were walking by and saw my father, and that's where they first met. And that evening they went to the movies, and my father was there as well. And I guess they must have talked to each other or something. And anyway, that evening he told his father that that was the girl he was going to marry. So had the Einsteins not invited them all for tea, I might not be here.
Wow.
Or in a different form.
When your mother became a painter, was it intimidating to follow in the footsteps of someone like your grandfather, who had been so successful and so prominent?
I don't know that she ever used the word intimidating, but I think she learned a lot from him, and he taught her a lot. And I think she built her own career, which was quite different from his. Their styles were not all that dissimilar, but she was much more interested in children and social events of one sort or another. And so I don't think their paths really crossed to the extent that she would ever be considered to be in awe or jealous, but I think she just greatly appreciated all that he taught her. I mean, she studied apart from that, but that was certainly good. And there's one picture actually at the museum which I always find interesting. it's the same girl who was a friend of ours when we used to spend our summers in Rockport, Massachusetts, which is just north of Boston. And there's a picture of a girl called Leslie Robinson, and there's a picture of her done by my mother and one done by my grandfather, and they're next to each other in the museum, so you can see the different styles for the same subject.
Wow. You get a sense of your mom's life and her social circles from the paintings in the museum as well. Can you tell me about the young Justin Trudeau? I know he used to summer here as well as a young kid, but I don't know where that portrait was done.
I never knew that he summered here as a kid, but my mother was very friendly with his father, with Pierre, and also to a lesser extent with Margaret. And my mother did a lot of painting of Trudeau, and I found one. Unfortunately, it was after she died, so I could never follow up on it. But he did a sketch of my mother when she was in the visitors gallery, doing a sketch of him in Ottawa. And I wish I could have got some details as to how that came about. But both were dead by the time I found the picture. But it's hanging in the museum. And but my mother was a great fan, but also of the whole family, and she did pictures of the kids. And I know the first one she did of Justin, he was about 1, and I found some old photos of Margaret holding him in her arms. I've got them here, but there are also some portraits of Justin as a young guy hanging in the museum. And I believe there's going to be a caucus meeting here in September, and I'm hoping to get Justin to come over and either have a little reception here or at least come and see the picture.
Wow.
Pictures.
Your mom was also successful commercially as well, having worked with huge brands, Holt Renfrew, having done work for, I believe it still is, Canada's biggest women's magazine, Chatelaine. So she was quite ahead of her time.
Well, she loved doing illustrations, and there was also a magazine called The Montrealer that disappeared in the 1950s, but has now been reincarnated, and it's called The Montrealer again. But she did several covers of the original Montrealer, which are really cute. And we have them. We have one of the rooms in the museum has a whole lot of the commercial stuff that my mother did, and the covers she did at the Montrealer are there, and also a letter she received from the union representing the bus drivers of Los Angeles, because she went out there to paint children of Debbie Reynolds and Jane Mansfield and a couple of other people, and she was to be interviewed by the Los Angeles Times, and she didn't have a car at that point. She didn't drive, and so she took the bus down to downtown LA from Pacific Palisades, where she was staying, and somehow, being my mother who was able to do these things, she got the bus driver to detour to take her directly to the door of the LA Times, and she must have mentioned it in her interview because it got published, and then the next day she got a letter from the head of the bus drivers union saying it was the first time that anybody said anything nice about the bus drivers of Los Angeles, and they presented her with a bouquet of flowers and all sorts of stuff, and all that stuff is at the museum. I've got that up on the wall, and she became very friendly with Jane Mansfield, and she painted her kids. And I actually was home from boarding school at one point when Jane Mansfield came to Montreal. I think it was in '61 to open a shop. I think it was the Fairview Shopping Center in Montreal, and she called my mom, and my mom invited her for dinner, and I happened to be home, and so we all had dinner in the kitchen of our place in Westmount. And she was there, so I actually met her not that long before she was killed.
Wow. Now, obviously, the desire to do art passed down from your grandfather to your mother. Do you paint?
The buck stopped there. I'm the critic and the organizer, and I know what I like. I did some little painting when I was younger, but I don't even have time. I don't have time to do what I have to do, let alone something like that.
Well, your museum is definitely a tribute to the arts in its own way. So thank you so much, Vincent, for sitting down with me today.
Well, it was a pleasure, and I hope we'll see lots of people coming. We're open Wednesday to Sunday from 10 to 4 until sometime in September probably.
Well, I will be back for sure. Thanks
Good.
so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
My guest today has been Vincent Prager of the Oppenheimer-Prager Museum at Dayspring. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.